Welcome to Future Conversations, the podcast that explores research through the lens of tomorrow by Monash University, Malaysia.
I am Professor Meera Sivasodi, and welcome to the podcast that's grounded in research and explores the future through conversations today. With me, Dr. Megan Clark, AC, who stepped into the role of Chancellor of Monash University in July 2024, a highly accomplished and respected individual, renowned for her significant contributions to science and technology in Australia. We are discussing the rapidly growing space industry. Welcome, Dr. Megan. How are you?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
You know, your career started off, you're a geologist.
I am. I'm a geoscientist. I started as a geologist.
Goodness, okay. So, a geologist, you went into mining, you went into science, you went into finance, and the space agency. You led the Australian Space Agency after that.
Well, we didn't have a space agency, so Australia was one of the few developed countries that had not developed a space, agency. Whilst in the 60s, we had been right there at the forefront, working with the US, with the UK, but over the subsequent decades, we had not participated fully in the space sector. So we had a bit of catching up to do, and we still have a bit of catching up to do. But yes, I was delighted to be able to establish our Australian Space Agency just a few years ago.
Wonderful. And a little bird told me that back in the day when you kicked off your career in the mining industry, women were not allowed to go into the mines, and you championed for women, to start working in the mines. Tell me about that.
Well, it was true. So when I first started under the Mines Act, women were not allowed to work underground, but it was a law that had been put in place to stop the slavery of women and the use of children in the mines in England. So the law actually had a very decent base, but it was now no longer timely. So, but it was still enforced, and so the rules were that you weren't allowed to work blatantly in front of the mines inspector, which when the mines inspector came once to my mine, and I was at that time working underground, he then reported me for prosecution. So past the mine, we passed our safety check, which I thought was very good. That was pretty confronting. I think I was 21. I'd only graduated a few years before, just graduated. And so it's very confronting at the beginning of your career to run into what I would call a structural barrier for women. So that was, a big challenge to overcome. I was lucky in that, as it turns out, the Queen of England can provide an exemption from any law for any Australian citizen. Not a well-known fact. So I said, well, I think she's pretty busy, and I'm not sure she really cares that much, and we need it by next week, right? But the Queen's representative, the governor of the state, then provided me with an exemption from the law, so I couldn't be prosecuted under the law, which was wonderful. But it caused such a fuss, and raised the profile that then the law was changed as it should have been.
Right, fantastic. An achievement for sure. Then you went on to be a scientist and then to finance.
I did, and it was an interesting thing to add a different professional technical background to my scientific background, which actually helped me in my later career. So I didn't know anything about finance, but I did apply for an internal role that was in venture capital, early stage investing in technology, and I was lucky enough to get that. And it just allowed me to put commercial and financial knowledge and skills I had to learn on the job together with my scientific background. And without that, I would not have been able to progress, I think, into some of the management leadership roles that I had, which is something that I talk to younger people and so you have to get your profession underneath your belt, learn your skills, learn your trade, go deep into your trade. But after that, you can really go anywhere. Yes. And you need to add to those skills. You can broaden those skills out once you've learnt your trade, once you've learnt your profession. So I was certainly an advice that I provide to young people.
And how did that science background shape your role in the Australian Space Agency, as well as in CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation? You mentioned the Australian Space Agency wasn't there yet when you came on board.
Yeah, how did it shape? I've always been really driven by two things, and right through my whole career there's really two things. One, I genuinely believe in the excellence of science and also the power of innovation to build nations. This is really about building value for your country, for the nation. And I have believed in both of those, and whilst my career looks, it has some turns and curves all the way through, it's just my love of exploration, my love of discovery, and then of course you come to space, and it's really the thrill of exploring into and beyond our solar system, living and working off our own planet, the use of science, but also the use of technology, and how we operate, how we do the hardest things in space. But then we learn how to do them, and then we bring them to Earth, and then they become part of a better world here on Earth as well. So it seems like a natural progression, but it really started with that curiosity of science.
I mean, there are challenges facing the space industry today, Dr. Megan. What are some of those challenges? The first one I need to ask you is, space exploration is expensive, but does it translate to economic value?
Space exploration is expensive, particularly when it's human space exploration, but actually the cost of getting into space has come down quite a bit. We now have students that can work on a student program and put a satellite up. So in some areas the cost has come down quite a bit, but it is expensive. And so, especially with the challenges that we have, people's daily lives, how do we help improve everyone's life? When we look at the space sector now, how we communicate, we forget that many of our phone calls now go through different optic fibres, go up to space, come down from space. 3/4 of the space sector and the space commercial sector is communication, and will be into the future. So how we communicate now, but also how we communicate. That's bringing the internet to places around the world, even remote Australia, where we have not had internet connection, where the children have not had access to what they need for skills. So already space is changing what we do here on Earth, and it gives us that view as well to protect our planet from space.
There have been challenges. Would you like to go through some of them with me? I mean, I think space debris is very much known to most people, which is a problem at the moment. Space resource utilization, cyber threats. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think space debris is one of the most significant challenges, because when you look at putting assets into space and we look at how much we now have, so over 10,000 pieces of debris that can cause damage to assets. So when you think about it, if you want to put your satellite, Malaysia wants to put a satellite up for communication, you have to get to your parking lot. So you have to launch, and now you're navigating into your parking lot with getting through space debris that can damage. And then when you're in your orbit, you also have to worry about even things like a little speck of paint. It's travelling at 28,000 kilometres an hour. You imagine hitting that with your windscreen. So the damage that can be done. This is a real issue, and it needs to make sure that we have the right laws and we have the right responsibility for how we act in space. Otherwise, it could actually damage our capacity to operate in space.
Talk to me about international space laws. I mean, they seem fragmented at the moment. Is there a way around this?
It's a really good question. So first of all, let me kind of give you a bit of the hierarchy. We started off with the law of the sea, and the law of space has its heritage in that. And then we have the laws at different levels. So at the United Nations, we have 5 major treaties, 5 major principles. The key ones of those I would highlight with the peaceful uses of outer space, and also the Moon Treaty. Australia is a signatory to all of the UN treaties. So you have these multinational agreements as well, which we sign up to. But then you come down to the country level. Actually, before the country level, you even have multilateral agreements that are outside the UN, such as the US Artemis Accords, for how we will work on the Moon. And that is all the countries that will work together on the Moon with the US sign the Artemis Accord. So we can have multilateral agreements. And then countries need to ratify their adherence to the United Nations treaties. So then you have the country laws. And in Australia, when we first started the Space Agency, one of the first things we did was revise our Space Act. So our Space Act didn't include high-powered rockets. It didn't include a provision for, just as we've talked about, for how we take responsibility for not creating more space junk and not creating more problems in terms of space. So we had all of those things wrapped into our own country legislation. And then some countries, you can go different ways in how we use resources. So the peaceful use of outer space requires that we need to be able to work in space for the good of humankind, and we can't own celestial bodies, so we can't use that. But now you have countries like Luxembourg saying, well, we'll set up country laws that allow you to do that. So this is an area that there are a lot of people working. I would say to the young graduates who are thinking of doing law, or any students thinking of doing law, we desperately need space lawyers. And so if you want to be a cool lawyer, definitely do space law, because you can see it's an exciting area, but it's going to need wisdom. We're going to need justice, where maybe in some places there is no justice. And we're going to need sensible working models that can address some of these really big challenges and competing priorities.
I think the biggest challenge is the fact that space doesn't belong to anyone. How do you govern if space doesn't really belong to any particular person?
Exactly.
I mean, with sea, we have country space when it comes to sea and things like that, but not with space.
No, exactly. And so even things like you see in the United Nations, all countries, who are signed up to the UN treaty commit that if an astronaut lands on your sovereign territory, you must return the astronaut. What about things that return from space to Earth, etc.? So it's quite complicated. How do we operate in those jurisdictions? And in low Earth orbit, such as the International Space Station, but also we're going to live and work on the Moon. We're going to live and work on Mars. So now we'll have communities which bring all the complexity of humans working together. You think we have 100 countries who have been working in the International Space Station, so you have all of that complexity, and we need to work out how to do that in a wise way.
Are you confident we'll be living and working in Mars?
Oh, yeah, I'm certainly confident we'll be doing that. One of the biggest challenges is not just the time it takes, so we have a 6 to 9 months return journey to Mars, but getting there means that you will be exposed to radiation. So even the International Space Station is still protected from some of our magnetic field that wraps around the Earth and protects us from space radiation and from solar wind. But when we travel to Mars, that will not be the case. And so it's the time, and the teams are working really hard on how to protect the astronauts from radiation in the travel to and from. And then how do you do that on the surface of the Moon, and how do you do that on the surface of Mars? So there are significant challenges that could stop us that the teams are working on right now.
The international partnerships of space agencies, US, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada, very politically complex space exploration program when it comes to international space stations. I mean, it's very complex and probably the most complex ever undertaken. Would you agree?
It is complex, and we have seen wonderful examples such as the International Space Station where countries have collaborated. We see that happening right now in countries that having tensions perhaps on Earth but collaborating as we have in the past in space. I think that's some of those are really good models. As we move forward, one thing that's changing in space is it used to be the area of sovereign governments. Now it's moving into commercial space. We have SpaceX, we have Axiom, we have intuitive machines operating robotics on the surface of the Moon. As we move more into the commercial realm, we will start to see different competition as well in space, and we will see different groups forming partnerships as well. You certainly hope that with the difficulty, it actually brings people together to cooperate in space.
You're very optimistic. You're looking at the brighter side of things. Collaborations between government, industry, and academia. I think it's going to be essential to unlock the full potential of the space industry. How could Monash University, for an example, or universities play a larger role in this three-way partnership?
Well, first of all, it's absolutely important that we train people who can work in that sector. And often we think of that as being quite restricted. You know, perhaps they need to be an engineer, or perhaps they need to sort of specialise in rocket design, etc. And I don't think that's at all what we see. And certainly, as we built up the Australian Space Agency, we took people from completely different areas, from areas of design, from areas of communication with the public. We certainly need engineers for aerospace design and for some of the componentry, but you also need philosophers. If we discover evidence of life on Mars, or as we travel to Europa below the frozen surface of the Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter, this will require us as a race philosophically to think, what does that mean? So when you think of what you need, and I mentioned space lawyers, etc., there's such a range of people that will be required to support this sector going into the future.
And do you see academic research opportunities?
I certainly do. I already look at what Monash is doing. So one of the first programs we did was the student-led teams. We had student-led team for the Nova rover, which was wonderful. The Nova rover was pink, and we took, and the two leaders, wonderful young leaders, and they took a lot of the women students and put in a team. I think they came second in the world. They're now working, many of the people who were in that team are now working on the, putting forward proposals for Australia's first rover on the moon. So there's a great example of a student program. We have student teams as well working in high-powered rocketry examples, and also just in aerospace engineering. So we're already working in that area, and quite a bit of deep expertise in propulsion, rocket design, and use of new materials. Because when you're in space, with radiation, with the challenges of space, with just the vibration of getting out into space, you need to use light materials that can also withstand all of the rigours and harshness of the space environment.
What were some of your challenges when you were leading the Australian Space Agency?
It was the first time I'd ever started something from absolute scratch.
And what was the inspiration behind it?
Well, certainly the country had wanted to do this. It was really interesting when I went round, and I first of all led the review into whether we should or shouldn't have an agency, and didn't matter where I went in the country. They knew that we had been at the shoulder of the US for the Apollo missions. We were the receiving country for the communication when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. The world would not have seen those pictures if they hadn't been captured in Australia. And interesting, they came in upside down, and luckily we had a cameraman who just took those. He was a cameraman with the Australian Broadcasting Commission. He said, I know how to do this, and he in real time re-filmed it, and so those images that you saw came directly from Australia. So we were right there, and then we had not participated fully. So the country was right behind this. But then the challenges of starting, we started with 4 people. We had 2 people who'd been part of the regulatory group, a couple of people, and then we literally just started with a couple of people. It's quite daunting. And so you can't be daunted by it. You have to just say, what are the foundations we're going to lay brick by brick? And we did that, and we changed the space law, and we slowly built up that. We built up a partnership with the US to return to Moon and onto Mars. And so working with the funding from the groups and building our partnerships. So it was a delight to be able to do that. And right from the very start, we said this is a sector that doesn't have equal diversity. A long heritage of that, but we made the decision that we would be 50-50 male-female from top to bottom. So from our advisory board right through to our graduates, and it was delightful to see, because we didn't have the expertise, so we were bringing in people who'd never been in the sector. It was fantastic to see that team flourish. We still give everyone a single number. So we have literally from Space Agent number 1. So
You
when you
was-
arrive...
you were Space Agent number 1.
Well, I'm Space Agent number 1, and my colleague was Space Agent number 2. We had, as I said, a couple of people who'd been in the regulatory team. And you keep that for life. So we said, we'll be in this game for 100 years. It'd be fantastic to keep track of all of our people. And so, you keep that number for the rest of your life. So it was a challenge, but it was exciting, and we had the country behind us. You always, in those situations, whether you're NASA chasing $22 billion a year or whether it was us chasing a much smaller amount, you need to engage with the government and have the support of your nation, whichever country you are. So that's always something that you're working hard for.
Do you think the space industry will meet its potential?
Oh, I think we're going to see tremendous changes. When you look at the changes that we've seen more recently with the advent of moving from government-supported programs to now commercial programs, when you look at the lowering of the cost, as I said, students can put an asset in space now. When you look at the opportunity for us to return to live and work on the moon, to be able to have what comes after the International Space Station, so the plans for several space stations, but now involving commercial as well as government collaboration. So when you look at that, the return to the first humans on Mars, and then the exploration in our solar system, where we'll start to explore, as I said, the moons of our planets and go beyond our solar system. So two Voyager satellites have now gone beyond our solar system. So for the first time, the science that we can do, and then the technology, when you think of what we have to develop, the power systems, solar energy, we use nuclear as well. How are we going to power off our planet? We'll bring all that technology back. How do we communicate? We use radio waves now. Your profession is in radio.
Yes.
The future is to use laser light. We already use light in space. We use light in our fiber optic communication. We will now move from radio to a much higher bandwidth of using light in space. So even the future of how we communicate on Earth will be driven by what we do in space. Well, I don't know what the potential is. You say, will we meet the potential is your question. I think in space, you cannot limit your vision. You cannot limit your vision. You can't imagine what we will be doing, but you know it's going to be exciting, and you know that everything we do and that is hard to do, whether it's communication, whether it's propulsion, whether it's the robotics we'll need, whether it's how we operate as teams, we bring all that back to Earth. And my hope, and certainly my vision, is that what we do in space actually will make us look after our own planet, look after our own people a lot better than we do now.
There's this space tourism that's emerging as an industry. What do you think? There are a lot of people who think it's a waste. Money could be put into good use for either space exploration or even compare it to climate change. Can't we put money into climate change? What are your thoughts?
I think it's a really good consideration and needs deep thought as well. How do we use our resources? So you can look at space tourism and say, well, that's frivolous. That's a lot of money from an individual. But if we go back to when we first had aviation was, one, dangerous. People dressed up. Only a very few people could afford to travel on the very earliest planes. Some of them, as I said, the accident rate was high. But we now look at that as being something that we take for granted. So it's the start of how we pave the way. And as we start to live and work on space, the cost of that, as I said, will start to come down, etc. But it's more, I look at what it enables on Earth. And one of the examples to me that's very close to my heart, I was born premature, so we see that as we take our astronauts, they are monitored for everything. Every second of the day, they're monitored fully. It means that if they're out doing a spacewalk, the team on Earth can say, look, you need to slow down, your heart rate's gone a bit too high. We've taken that same both AI and sensing technology to support neonatals. And where you've used 50 years of knowledge and scientific data from looking after newborn babies, we now can do that sensing for newborn babies. Because when a newborn baby kind of has difficulty, they crash very quickly. So if we can see that 2-3 hours beforehand, we can intervene. That's the kind of technology that you think that is extraordinary. So whilst it might be for one very elite astronaut that has cost a lot of money to get there, to be able to use it for hundreds of newborn babies, to me is a perfect example of sometimes you push the boundaries with space, but we apply it on Earth for everyone's life.
So no one owns space, as I was mentioning, or as I mentioned earlier, but it affects all of us in a different way. How will this better our lives on Earth, and what would you like to leave us with?
You mentioned climate change, and I think the way we look at Earth from space is extraordinarily important. Take, for example, the Japanese satellite Himawari, which looks at our cloud patterns, an extraordinarily useful satellite. We absolutely need to understand the change of our climate systems. As we move to mitigate our emissions, we also need to understand what are the changes and how we do that. The view from space is incredibly important to the models of our climate systems, to looking at where rain is falling, how much, the timing of that during the year, to look at our vegetation systems. We even monitor the surface, the sea level surface is monitored from space. So all of the information that you hear in those reports of sea level rise has risen 20 centimetres, that's all coming from space measurements of sea level, which I don't think is appreciated. So space is fully involved in our scientific understanding and our mitigation for climate change. And I think the other piece for me is that if you remember that photograph, that so important photograph of Australia rising, of the world rising, the beautiful blue planet as it was seen for the first time when we were off our planet, and the astronauts took that beautiful photo. There was no boundaries. There was just this very fragile planet with a very thin atmosphere. The view from space, I think, helps us not just in the practicality of navigating through climate change, but it helps us see how fragile our world is, how thin our atmosphere is. So my view is, as we explore beyond our own planet, it will help us care for our own planet.
Your message as the new Chancellor of Monash University?
I would just like to encourage other young people to make sure that they are following their curiosity, whatever it is, to not just progress their education after high school, but to do that for the rest of their life. And that's really a legacy of Sir John Monash, our founder, was, not just to equip yourself for your own life, but for your community. How do you do that in a lifelong sense is so important to us. And so I would just encourage our people who are looking at their education just to think of how they can do that to support their community, whether it's their street, their suburb, their area, their town, their country, the world, or off our world. How can they make the world a better place?
Thank you for joining us. Dr. Megan Clark, Chancellor, Monash University, speaking to us about the space industry. I'm Professor Mira Sivisodi for Future Conversations, a podcast by Monash University, Malaysia.
You were listening to Future Conversations, a podcast by Monash University, Malaysia. For more information, email mum.media@monash.edu.